morning. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Julie Atkins and I'm a Principal Relationship Manager specialising in change management in NHS Digital. I'd like to introduce my NHS Digital colleague, Martin Dennys, Associate Director for COVID-19 Public Inquiry Response and Child Protection Information Sharing. Martin's a Chartered Project Professional and is Head of Project, Programme and Portfolio Delivery Profession at NHS Digital, also known as PPPD. He reviews major projects across government as a high-risk review team leader for the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Martin's a strong advocate of project managers employing a wide range of delivery methods, practices and tools, and applying the most appropriate approach or approaches to the task at hand. Martin draws on his broad project management experience across both public and private sector, having delivered IT and digital-based projects to make step changes in services to meet customer requirements. So he's well placed to talk to us about what's different about digital project management in healthcare. Digital components of projects seem to attract new language and methods, some of which appear at first to be at odds with classic project delivery. So what is the role of project manager in delivering projects in healthcare where there are digital aspects? I'll let Martin enlighten us. As he does so, please add your comments in chat, put your questions in the Q&A section, and Martin will answer them at the end of the presentation. Martin, over to you.
Julie, thank you very much indeed for that lovely introduction. Right, well, I'll go straight into the sort of topic and area that we're talking about in terms of what is different about digital project management within healthcare. And at the end, as Julie said, I'm happy to answer any questions as we go through. So I'm going to set out some sort of basic principles around projects first of all. So projects, why do we do them? Well, we do them to address a problem for a user. We change a service or create a service there to improve or deliver outcomes to those users and to those people. That's principally why we do projects. Now, I'm going to define a few basic terms in terms of how we approach these things, just so that we're all talking the same language. And I'll throw more language and terms later on during the chat and the conversation. So outputs, they're delivered by products. They're quite tangible quite often in terms of how they're delivered. They might be digital, but they are tangible in terms of how they come through. The outcomes, which is going to be a core part of what I'm going to talk about today, is the goal for the user. It's their solution to their problem. And I'll give you an example shortly about that in terms of what that means. So a service then is the whole package of how a user achieves that goal and the steps they take and the products and things that exist to make that happen. The product or a product is a tangible thing. It might be physical, it might be digital, but it is something that exists that helps with that journey and activity that is being followed by the user. And a business platform is a grouping of products and activities and services that enable an interaction between two parties. So an example is the NHS app, which many of us now are familiar with following the recent pandemic. So the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of what we do as project management is really service design. So Model Hospital is a great example of that. So a service design is the process of orchestrating the end-to-end activity, the journey that users are going to follow in terms of achieving their outcomes. But it looks at everything that happens on that journey. So top to bottom, in terms of everything that might be digital, that might be physical, that happens during that journey. But when we do service design, we mustn't be just focused on, just because I come from a digital background, it's not about the digital being everything. And I appreciate this topic is around digital, but in reality, we have to think what's called cross-channel. There are people who can't access digital, but also there are aspects to a service that have a non-digital element to it. So we have to think of the entirety of that when we're looking at it. So service design is that entirety of end-to-end, top to bottom, and a cross-channel in terms of how that service is being delivered. So I'm going to go to a very topical example. So the example here is somebody wants to be successfully vaccinated. Now, there's a whole number of different, this is a simplified model, obviously, in terms of that service. So the big chevron triangular bit there is the overall service. There's a nested service within that. You can see in the triangles, there's a couple of channels in terms of how that can be delivered. And there's a number of products that come out of it in terms of the various steps that go there. There's a nested outcome within it in terms of the successful appointment, but in the end, the aim is the individual gets their successful vaccination at the end of it. So that hopefully gives you an example and a flavour. What I'm going to do now is talk a bit about some of the things around designing a service in general. So now moving on to things that apply to all of your projects and all of the work you're doing, but keep this one in mind if you haven't got one of your own, in terms of the thought that goes into delivering this. And bear in mind, a lot of what is there is actually a very physical thing in terms of the vaccination site. It has an awful lot of logistical practicalities in terms of, vaccines, the site and navigation, everything else that goes around it. Many of you will be familiar with it. So in terms of a service, and this, as a project, we have a number of influencing factors around our projects and the services that we have to design and create. A lot of them are what I term the sort of top level. So it's about national policy, it is best practice, it's about learning, it's about performance, those types of things. So those will drive either new services or improvements to services that we have. But if we're going to do a project and we're going to change something, we're going to need a business case. And that business case captures all those drivers, and it secures the money based on benefits and improvements that we're going to see down the line. But that business case is actually going to include a whole host of other factors and things that are involved in terms of things and factors that we need to take into account in terms of what we are doing. So these will be things that you will consider as part of the project and what you're doing, and they all influence what's going on. And as you can see, there's quite a few components to that need to be considered. So I'm now going to move on to our stakeholders. So the first and most important stakeholders we have are our users. And I want to be really clear here, it's not just about the patients, it's absolutely about our staff in terms of what they do, because they're the ones that deliver that service, and they're an integral part of making it happen and providing that service and delivering those outcomes for the patients. So again, there's a whole host of other stakeholders that need to be considered when we are doing a project, and you'll be familiar with this in terms of this sort of broad consideration in terms of project delivery. At the top, you've got a number of the sort of big corporate influencers and people that will be relevant to it. But you've got a whole host of others that are really important in terms of designing of a service, be it within an A&E department, be it any aspect of service and delivery that you are looking at. So all these people and groups need to be included in terms of the project, the service, its design, how that's going to work. But just to emphasize, it is the users, the patient, the patients and the staff that are the most important. And you all would have come across scenarios whereby various stakeholders have got their own view on something that actually makes it potentially harder for the patients or staff to navigate that service. So it's really important as a project manager that we have, and I'm going to come back to it more so, that the users, the patients and staff are really front and center in terms of thinking about the design of services and improvements to them. So then I'm going to start talking about the delivery team. So the project manager, this role that has got to deal with this variety of influencing factors and a variety of stakeholders. There is a veritable army of people that are relevant in terms of the delivery of this activity. So there's the service owner that's responsible for this service, say an E&E department. You've got a whole host of really important subject matter experts who are the clinical people, the people that run the service and operate that in terms of its delivery, and need to be a part of that consideration and thought. The other roles that I put up there are all digital roles. And I think there's a presentation later on today to talk about DDAT and some of those roles in more detail. I'll explain them really briefly because it is important that as a project manager, you understand what some of those are. So there's a small cluster here around user research, content design, interaction, and these are all about talking to the user communities, staff and patients, and holding sessions with them. And there's a particular set of tools, skills, and ways of engaging with them to elicit an understanding of what they're trying to achieve and what is the best journey and route path for them. And then think about the content, think about how they're going to interact with that. You may find people that can do a number of those skills together, but sometimes it is different people depending on the size and scale of what you're doing. You may have somebody who's a service designer who's looking at the service as a whole in terms of how that feels and how it operates. There's also a couple of other roles towards the bottom there that are really quite important. So one is the product manager. So in the example I gave before, there are a number of products that are being delivered as a part of that service, and a product manager will own that and look at its development map and its journey and how it's going to progress over time. And the digital delivery manager is really focused, laser focused on the digital elements of delivery and how it's going to be achieved. And I've got a couple of slides to go into more detail about how they focus, what they focus on, and how these digital skills work together. But really importantly, those digital things are only really going to have an effect if you've got an implementation and business change component to it, which is why those roles are there, because somebody has got to translate those digital things and interactions into how's the business going to operate, often very differently to what they've done before. It's really important you've got those skills to be able to do that translation. And you've probably noticed there's a whole host of other skills that I haven't talked about yet. We've still got all those other IT and technical skills around. So a lot of the digital skills I've talked about there are different in terms of their focus and nature to the classic IT project delivery. Often it's a nuance or a change of style and approach. A number of the people on the IT side may well be able to have the skills to be able to do those things, but they're now being called out as being very specific skill sets in terms of how they operate. So you'll be looking at this and saying, how on earth is a project manager going to deal with all those different components? And that is part of the challenge about project management in a digital world, is that there are so many people involved in that delivery, and the coordination of that is quite an art in terms of understanding the different skills that each of them provide, how to bring them together efficiently and effectively. But one of the biggest problems there is terminology. So IT terminology has been around for many decades now, but digital, although it has been around for a couple of decades, is relatively new in terms of being so prevalent and in the forefront in terms of engagement with people. And it's got a whole host of terminology that's quite different. There are massive courses that last days and weeks that go through these. So clearly I'm not going to go through them all now, but there are aspects around, ideation. So coming up with ideas and, thinking about the design, having a hypothesis of what might work and trying to validate that, looking at your users, so your patients and staff, creating a persona for them in terms of what their requirements are, and taking that through a journey and creating what's called stories. And there's terminology like epics, sprints, backlogs. Now, a lot of this terminology can be quite off-putting, particularly for clinical people and others who just don't get that terminology. So one of the things that project managers need to do is to understand it themselves and help with that translation, help people use a common set of terminology that needs to be used between them. As I say, fortunately, there's somebody later on today who's going to talk about DDAT and some more of that. But there is an aspect around the project manager really need to get into that. And as Julie did in her introduction for me, to me, this is just another set of tools that go into the project manager toolkits that you take along to your work and have those available and use as appropriate. So all of this is, I've talked a lot about the design, about the user, again, patients and staff. And so I want to just explore that a little bit further, because that is around an explicit understanding about what the user's doing. To do user-centered design, as it's called, and this is part of the sort of focus in digital, is the user's then involved throughout the whole process. It's not something you do at the beginning and then go in a dark room, create something and throw it back at them, because things will change and the understanding will change over time. And it's done through that evaluation with the user in terms of what they need. And often it's iterative. So the user says, I want to do X. You create X in a short time frame and they go, oh, actually, I would prefer to do X plus Y or X minus Z and in a different way. And so the ability to be able to iterate, that's really important. It's also looking at the entire user experience, which is why I started with the whole service design aspect to it, because if you get some of it wrong, you can have a process or a service that feels fine and then just feels disjointed, and you lose the engagement and you end up with problems that have to be dealt with in the live service. And as you've seen, there is a plethora of multidisciplinary skills and disciplines that are involved in it. With a lot of these smaller projects, you're going to struggle to get, well, you won't get full-time people doing that. So there is some art to project management where you look at where those skills are and you use some of those part-time in terms of what you're doing and how you're operating. But I think one of the things to bear in mind with this is this whole aspect around user-centered design. It's an international standard. It's been around for 20 years. And actually, if you look at the terminology around it, it's not digital specific. It's not technology specific. You can think about a journey that a patient goes through an A&E department or through an outpatient department, and all of this terminology is equally applicable. And I've got something that I use a lot of times when I'm speaking to people, which is digital and technology. It's an enabler. It doesn't do the thing on its own. Even with the example that I showed there around the vaccination, the digital helps it happen in a more fluid manner. But if it was a rubbish process, the digitization of that would still be rubbish. So do think about although this topic is around digital in healthcare and being different, a lot of the aspects are equally applicable in non-digital concepts. So the next thing I want to talk about is the fact that digital teams have an optimal working style and environment. So they have some approaches that may seem slightly strange to other people in terms of how they operate. So they look at the individuals and the interactions and say they're more important than the process and the tools. They try and minimize interdependencies. And that's because then you've got a team that's really empowered and can focus on what they're doing. They look at the working software or the working service as being a principal measure of their progress and what they're doing. And this approach of iterative delivery, so trying to deliver things early and then improving on it so that you see some benefits straight away. And strangely for project management, they welcome changes. Historic project management says, well, give me my scope, I'll work to that, and I will defend any changes, or any changes become a change control in terms of how you operate it. Digital looks at that very differently and says, well, actually, if you carry on with the scope that you've got and people say it's not going to work, you're just going to create something that doesn't work very well. So welcoming changes, it has a balancing to it. So you can't just add things to it and expect to be done the same time scale. So there's a whole set of mechanisms to deal with prioritization, saying, well, we've got a capability and a scope to deliver things. We can change it as we go along and iterate it. But clearly there's a certain capacity there in terms of how much we deliver. So there's prioritization that goes with it. So the result of that is that digital teams deliver value frequently, on a number of iterations. They do what's called fail fast. So if something doesn't work, they find it out quick, stop, and go and do something else. So that learning process is really important. So rather than spending weeks or months on something that actually doesn't fit the bill, you understand and work that out quickly and adjust your direction of travel. The principle being you end up with more satisfied users and customers because they're involved in that and that whole discussion the whole time. So going back to the project manager, so what is their role within this environment? Because you've got a whole digital team that's doing the digital thing and delivery. But actually the project manager's got to be that point of knitting together everything that I've just talked about. And as you've seen with some of the slides, there's a lot of things to think about. It is a really complicated role with a number of different facets to it in terms of what it thinks about. It's got to think about the environment. It's got to break down silos. I've talked a lot about terminology and that translation that's needed, and certainly making sure there's a lot of collaboration and understanding of different ways of working and how they operate. I've described with the digital side that there's this sort of continuous iterative delivery, but actually there's a number of asynchronous things. So if you're doing changes within a hospital environment, for example, well, you've got to sort out your builders, you've got to sort out, changes to the physical environment, you've got to implement physical network. There's a number of things that don't follow that same iterative digital manner. And the project manager's got to coordinate both and make sure they are aligned in a timely manner. And the project manager's got to deal with different methodologies and different ways of working from different teams. And I talked about that minimizing of interdependencies. Well, the project manager's got to deal with all those because they don't go away necessarily. They've got to be managed differently. And the project manager's looking at that sort of broader outward and strategic focus. So how do they do that? Well, there's a whole, I'm sure that there's whole days I could spend sort of talking about it, but the sort of summary is these sorts of things, which is a relentless focus on the outcomes for the staff and patients, because they are the key people that are going to be doing it. That inclusion of the staff and patients, but also designing in inclusivity, so that multi-channel consideration for people with different physical, digital capabilities in terms of what they can do. There's a principle about team charters and the whole team spirit that goes with it. I've talked about user journeys and the paths that people follow. And really trying to look at it and going back to my point around the fact digital is an enabler. A lot of the conversation the project manager will be doing will be around how's this service going to work for patients of a variety of ages going through this journey, and how are people of different digital capabilities, either different physical capabilities, going to navigate that process, and for it to be a fluid process for them. And there's a real need for project managers to clarify which tools, processes, and methods are used and where, because it's very easy to use to try and use a blanket approach for everything, and actually you'll end up with a bunch of disjoint in terms of what's happening and people struggling to deliver things on time. So it's quite a complicated role. So I'm going to stop there in terms of what I've done. I know the slides are going to be available. And move on to Q&A. There's a number of links at the back of the slide that talk about, there are some on the gov.uk site around service manual, service standards. There are also some blogs that are quite approachable in terms of how that operates and what that means. And I've put a link to sort of the Prince 2 Agile, which tries to do some of that linkage between what I call classic project delivery, because it's still very much needed, and the Agile world in terms of how that operates as well. So I hope you found that useful. I'm going to turn to Julie and Donna to sort of help with lobbing questions at me.
I think Donna's providing the questions.
Yeah, yes, indeed, and we do have a few that have cropped up, as you'd expect. So I will kick off with sticking with the very, very digital theme. At first, is it important for a project manager to understand digital development in order to manage a digital project for delivery?
So that's a relevant question. I think it helps, but as I've said, a lot of what I've talked about is relevant regardless. So I think some of the terminology and the roles I think is important to understand. So the role of user research, the service design, the product manager, and the delivery manager. So understand their roles, even if you don't understand the technology. As with a lot of things, although there's digital there, the role of the project manager is make sure the service works. So if they can understand that user journey, the fact there's a number of technical people doing that build and making that digital thing work technically, that's all they need to understand. So I think it's more about understanding the skills that the roles provide that I think is going to be more important than actually being a digital expert per se. But there are a number of things there around, the consideration around accessibility. So there are various standards in terms of design of screens and networks. So people probably have seen either on government and other websites that there's a very simplistic format that is prevalent, and that's to make it as easy and navigable as possible. So there are aspects to get into, but I think you can, if you've got the right people, those digital people will help educate a project manager on that as they need to.
Thank you. And we have a question climbing the popularity board At number 1 at the moment, and you've already almost answered this at a tangent. The question is, the old hoary one, Prince 2 or APM, which is the better route?
Ooh. So APM is they're both project management methods. I think, talking about a digital world, you need to complement both with Agile. I have to be careful because I'm a chartered APM project professional, so I probably have some allegiances I need to declare up front. I would say, having gone through the APM process, I found the APM considerations slightly broader. Because it looked at things like health and safety, legal aspects, and various other bits, where I found when I've looked through Prince, it's quite vanilla or pure in terms of its consideration. It didn't, for me anyway, maybe it's changed a bit since I last looked at it, include references to some of the real world things that are always going to be there. So legislation, GDPR, health and safety, various other bits and things you've got to consider. But I think regardless of which route you go down, it's the complement of the Agile side. So all those, you've got Scrum and Kanban, that digital world that is going to make that more relevant, because it gives you the extra language and consideration that you need to do. And I mean, I think there's also, I'm going to answer a question that you've not asked me, which is what's better, Agile or project delivery? And I think some Agile people have got almost fixated that project delivery only worked in this very sterile, you give me a scope, I'm going to deliver it, and I'm going to try and minimize change. But actually, project delivery has always delivered in blocks or chunks, some longer than others, always cope with change, and always had the users and the desire of it in the center of what it's trying to do. I think what digital does is it emphasizes that more so, and means that there's a real focus on that user journey emphatically in terms of all the conversation, how it operates. So you get a bonus answer there.
Yeah, there's a whole career path in there. So well done. Another really popular question, and there are 2 questions involved in here. Everything Martin is saying makes sense. Good to know. But whilst the theory is great, how do we deliver this whilst the governance around us is either changing or is non-existing? No business ownership, for instance, limited real stakeholder engagement, no approvals body in place to approve a business case. This sounds very real world to me. How do we navigate these barriers?
So the project manager has a lot on their hands to do. So I think the things I put on the slide are really helpful for that. So if you've not got clarity on those things, that's part of the role of the project manager, to deal with the sticky stuff, where the difficulties are in terms of clarifying those things. So where you're unsure, who are the stakeholder sign-off process, that's the project manager job. The digital roles will struggle to deal with that thing, because they're focused on this iterative, I'm going to create a user journey and I'm going to follow it through. So the project manager has to create those links and make sure that there is sufficient coverage, the right people are involved, and the right representation. And it can be hard to do. I mean, within NHS Digital, we are going through quite a long process over a period of years, I would say, to take ourselves to the point whereby we're moving into this more digital user-focused thing, as opposed to what we term technology. Partly because a lot of our systems are national, and we've perceived that the user's somewhere else, and therefore somebody else deals with it. But we're getting closer to that in terms of what happens. It does take a lot of effort and activity. What I would say with digital is it's a team sport. So having spent today talking about the project manager role, actually the need to explain the approach, everybody needs to understand it. Because if I go to that huge array of people involved in delivery, if you've just got the project manager or just the digital people understanding what they do, and you haven't got everybody understanding how they play all their parts within it, and what the whole digital approach and terminology is, you're going to struggle. So there's a role there for the project manager to make sure that everybody understands digital, everybody understands service design, everybody understands user-centered design, at least to a bit of a level, so that they can all be thinking, that's the driver, that's why I'm focusing on it from that point of view. So I talk about redesigning an A&E or components of A&E, it's all got to be around the patient journey and just making sure there's focus on those things. So hopefully that helps.
Very good. I think we're moving now to a popular question which Julie may be able to help with here. Do we have enough NHS change managers and understanding of the change management role among senior NHS leaders to support the very many NHS digital projects on the go at the moment?
Do you want me to answer that, Martin?
Yeah, it was offered to you, so I'm quite happy to sit back.
I think the answer is no. We absolutely don't, but it is getting better. So one of the things I'm currently working on is I'm supporting frontline digitisation trusts to deliver their EPR we have a small team offering a change management support offer, which has been incredibly well received, because trusts now understand that they need this. Yes, they don't necessarily have the change management capacity that they need, and the answers we're getting back are pretty consistent. No trust has as much as they need, but they've recognised that it's more important now, particularly with tech, because we have delivered digital solutions into health settings for many, many years, and they have not been used. And I think we've proved the point now that we need more change management. And I think this is where the Healthcare Projects in Change Association and the relevant competencies and career pathways, etc., have to include change. And I know that's clearly it's part of the mission statement, it's part of the title of that association. So yeah, I think we're getting there, but no, the answer is still no, unfortunately.
And I'd absolutely support Julie in that, in terms of the need for those roles. It actually goes close to my heart. I'm a public governor, as it happens, for my local hospital, and they've recently been successful in getting some money for a new EPR system. And my point to them was exactly that: is that although it's a big IT digital change, actually it's the business change that's important. The digital is an enabler to redesign how things operate. Don't just digitize what you've got now. There's an opportunity with digital. Say, well, rather than having all these little steps and hand holding, the digital system can make that flow different and separately. And again, that's why the service design and then the user experience bit is really important. But it's down to business change. You can have the most amazing system implemented, but if the users don't engage, understand it, and it doesn't fit their journey, and they're not brought on the fact it's a new journey they have to follow, they won't get it and it won't work.
Thank you. Now, it's interesting you mention your role as a public governor there, because our next popular question mentions governance as well, and you can tell this has come from an NHS audience that are a bit worried about their governance. So the PM role is complex, you've explained that. What would be the best approach or governance model to ensure that we're always doing the right thing?
So and it does play to my governor role, actually, because there's some interesting things we're looking to change how the governors are involved, but that's a completely separate topic. So in terms of the governance around projects, I talked about some roles around a service owner. So somebody who owns that service. Let's use an A&E department, because people can relate to that. So who is responsible for that A&E service? And then, making sure that you've got the right representation in terms of, in a way, those changes as much as possible driven by people within the department, within the team, seeing that they can do better, and how do they do that? And is there exemplars and research elsewhere where they can see there's better practice? And what they want is they want the digital to do more for them. So the governance needs to have the right people at the senior level, but they've got to represent the team. It's the classic project aspect of, you've got to involve people to get the buy-in. And the senior people, obviously, they understand the performance metrics, the money, the investment that's required to make changes. So that's the key thing. But as you're doing it, if there's an opportunity to include actual patients in some of that consultation around, well, how can we improve this, and what's their experience around it, then that can be phenomenal. But there's the service design role. The reason I spent so much time on that in my conversation is that service design is something that needs that buy-in at the top level, and actually having somebody who's considering service design in a senior position within a trust or within an organization, I think is really important, because your whole livelihood is around the design efficiency of that, of your overall service, however complex it is.
Thank you, which very weirdly brings me on to the next question. It
This
really
is not
does.
scripted
I'm
at
not
all.
making this up. And about service design, would you agree that generally enough time and focus is given to the discovery or problem identification stage?
No. Simple answer, no. So people go into solution mode really quickly. You know, they either want to copy what somebody's done, or they want to do something different to what's happened before, and people launch into solution mode really quickly. And it's really easy to do. You think, oh, if only we just do this. The challenge with service design is that sometimes you get an answer you didn't expect or you didn't want, and some people might say, well, actually the users don't want that. They think that's going to be harder. They want this thing, which might be quicker and easier. It might be harder, but in a way, people have almost predefined a timescale, a solution. You know what's going to happen in a budget, and just sort of say, well, you've got a budget of X. You've got to do it in Y weeks, and that's the solution. And it takes time to do that engagement on the service design side. So no, I think in general it's not done, but it needs to be, and it's trying to warm people up to the fact that that's really important. But again, it's about talking about it early. You've got to do that as part of almost your business case preparation side of things, to say, well, you know, and there's this whole concept around that early engagement to be able to get some ideas around that.
Okay, thank you. So slightly different tack now. One of the biggest obstacles is that traditional assurance routes around spend controls, procurement, budget forecasts are, I love this term, sclerotic, inflexible and cumbersome, which is true. How do you, in a digital project, get around that?
Really good question, and I don't think there's a really good answer out there in the system at the moment. You know, part of what we're dealing with within our own organization is the fact that these products and services therefore have a multi-year timescale, and we will continue to improve them. And it is a real challenge. So the other challenge I've come across with it, this is quite an honest thing, is that often the digital teams are sort of told, well, you know, we don't want to restrict you by saying you've got to do things in certain manners. I talked about the fact that it's the journey as opposed to process and tools. You know, find your own route to get there. The challenge with that is that you can end up with inconsistency. So there is a need that even within this digital world, where you've got a number of options and ways of doing things, that you give some expectations on the types of information you expect to see. So you will see what's called a backlog, which is the future set of work you want to do. You can have what's called burn down charts, which is, you know, how quickly you're working through that. You have what's called a velocity. That's how quickly you're doing things. So I say the terminology starts coming out really quickly, which is your run rate in terms of how quickly you do things. And they do what's called t-shirt sizing, you know, small, medium, large, and you have a mix of those in terms of what you're doing. So the challenge is that those take a while to bed in and become stable. So from an assurance point of view, it's quite difficult to be able to go into that. So assurance, as I say, I don't think there's a really strong answer out there, but assurance needs to look at the different ways that digital tracks its progress in its work and what it's doing, so that it's keeping in mind that, you know, that approach, the language, and saying, well, have you got a good velocity? Is it stable? Are you delivering benefits? You've still got to measure benefits and those types of things. So there are some similarities, but definitely some different terminology and different styles and approaches required.
Thank you. And we got time for a further question? Because the questions are still rolling in. Okay, so this is not directly a question, but the questioner does ask, are we placing enough focus on a co-production approach using the lived experience of our end users? Perhaps this is something that we could be seeing more across the UK, and further sessions perhaps for the Compass programme for that.
Yeah, it's a good one in terms of just how that is done. I mean, obviously the topics I've talked about, I've skimmed the surface of many of them. So absolutely, there's more that can be done around that in terms of how we take that further forward and how we involve people more in that in terms of that delivery. And it'd be good to get some examples more on the front line in terms of what happens in a hospital, that type of thing.
And where does the balance lie between your hard technical and soft skills as a digital project manager?
I think they're more on the soft side, because I think I mean, obviously you've still got to have your delivery, your velocity in delivering things, because without that you're not managing the project, you're not delivering. But a lot of it, as I've explained, you've got so many influencing factors, you've got so many stakeholders, you've got so many people to coordinate. And because digital ends up being a lot more fluid, because you haven't got a set scope, you've got a set ambition, but the scope and the approach to it is going to vary. That's a lot more softer skills in terms of being able to drive that further forward. You still need some of the raw project skills there, and as I say, the toolkit that you've got that you take with you is considerable to be able to do it. But I would say softer skills are more important.
Okay, and that stimulated a question from me, really. So what you describe in your role is an exemplar of modern working methods, and it seems to me that the project manager is expected to be some kind of Superman. Yeah. To have all this entire package of skills. There's no one place to be trained for that. So what do you think are the qualities inherent in a project manager to enable them to take on all that stuff?
Well, some of it's on my I'm going to go back a couple of slides, because that was the slide here in terms of the sort of focus. So yeah, it's having quite an open mind to different ways of doing things, and being flexible, but not so flexible that you lose track of control. What I have seen with some of the digital side is that the desire to move to this more dynamic approach then loses its ability to sort of track what's going on. And some people say, oh, there's less documentation with digital or agile. It's not necessarily true. People who do it well, actually, there can be equivalent or even more documentation. It is done differently. So with digital work, with a digital world, you do a lot of your documentation as you create it, as you need it, as opposed to creating a lot up front. So the skills needed is that appreciation that there are different ways of thinking and dealing with it, but then the ability to channel that in terms of what people are doing. I mean, I agree, there's no single place to go to get all those skills. I think what it means is that a project manager is going to have to develop their skills over a number of different projects and different environments, because they'll see things in different scenarios and have to deal with it from that point of view. There is a lot of online learning and the like around, but a lot of this comes down to practice and working with good people who are experienced in terms of doing it, which it can in its own right be challenging, because getting hold of good experienced people can be difficult in terms of taking that further forward. So yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot to be done for a project manager, and I think one of the things I like about it a lot is the fact that it's quite broad in terms of its thinking. It's not just a single approach, but the project manager's got to orchestrate these people who've got some laser focus on various different approaches.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Donna. So I think we're just about out of time. And Martin, thank you very much for what someone in the comments has said has been a really engaging and awesome session.
That is very kind. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next session.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye.